Feel free to share this video and let other people know about the channel. And if you like this video, give it a thumbs up and leave any comments below as well about your experiences. So hopefully you enjoy this story. So as you listen to this story, you can take a moment to close your eyes. And I don't know whether you'll drift asleep faster with the sounds of my words, with my voice, or perhaps with the spaces between my words. And as you drift comfortably asleep, so I'll just tell you this story in the background. A story about a dog and his human companion. And the dog and his human companion are out walking one day. They're walking through the countryside. And the dog can smell a wide variety of smells, can sense far more than his human companion, can feel the way each footstep feels as he walks through grass, and how it changes when he walks along mud paths, and how the sound changes when walking out in the open compared to walking through woodland. And the dog and his companion are out walking towards a lake. And the dog knows where they're heading, because they've been there many times before. And as they walk, so the sun begins to set. And while the sun is setting, the dog can notice the way sounds begin to change around them. The way some animals seem to be going to bed, going to sleep, and other animals seem to be becoming more active. And after a little while of walking, they arrive at their destination. They arrive at a lake. And the dog's companion sets up a camp on the edge of that lake and goes off in search of some firewood. And while the companion's off in search of firewood, so the dog starts sniffing around, running down into that water, splashing through the water of the lake, excitedly running back on shore. And the dog wants to play, the dog wants to chase a stick or a ball or chase something. So the dog tries to get the companion's attention. And the companion, who's collecting firewood, picks up a stick and throws it off into the water while they carry on collecting the wood. And the dog turns around and bolts out towards the water, leaping off the side into that lake with a splash, swimming along and getting that wood, swimming back to the shore, feeling the way the paws push through the water, the way the fur feels as it moves under the water, running out onto the shore carrying that wood, bracing all four legs, and then vigorously shaking to get the excess water off, and then taking that wood to the companion. And while the dog's rushing around excitedly, so the sun continues to set, and as the sun sets, so the light begins to change, and the colours reflecting on the lake begin to change, becoming redder when you look in one direction, and bluer when you look in the other direction. Being aware of the smoothness of that water. And the owner, the companion, throws the stick again, and the dog runs off again, and the companion prepares a campfire. Lights the campfire, and the dog returns and can hear the crackling fire, can see the way the flames are flickering and dancing, the occasional popping and spitting of sparks. And the companion sits down and appears to begin to relax. And the dog initially wants to play with the stick a bit more, but the companion is just sat there, wanting to relax. So the dog ends up sitting next to them. And as the dog sits next to them, so they reach over and they start to stroke the dog's back, stroking by its neck. And as they stroke, so the dog begins to calm down and relax. And while the dog calms down and relaxes, their breathing begins to slow. They begin to pay more attention to the crackling fire, to the slight breeze, to the sight of stars appearing in the sky, as the sun sets lower and lower over the horizon, and the moon begins to rise. And the water of the lake changes from reds and oranges to almost looking like it's covered in jewels, with twinkling white light from the moon reflecting through that lake. And the companion cooks up some food on that campfire, gives the dog some of the food, eats some of the food for themselves. And is really just enjoying the evening as it gets later and later. And then, after eating, the companion goes into a tent, and the dog lies down near the tent, feeling the warmth of the fire, hearing that crackling, feeling the breeze, breathing calm and relaxed, and drifts off asleep. And while the dog drifts off asleep, so the dog begins to dream. And as the dog begins to dream, they find themselves running through a meadow with tall grass on a summer's day. They can feel the breeze, feel the way the tall grass brushes against them as they run through that meadow. And the meadow goes up and down, undulating over hills. They can see blue sky, white wispy clouds. And they run and bounce and jump and pant. And after a while, they see a brick wall and a brick bridge going over a small stream. And they see someone sat on the brick wall by the brick bridge. And they go over and they sit at the foot of that bridge. They sit in front of that person. And the person begins to talk in a calm and relaxed way to them. And they sit there politely panting, wondering what the meaning is of the words that person's saying, as that person seems to calmly and kindly be talking to them. And they don't understand the words, but they can sense the feelings while that person's talking. They can sense the way the person's talking. They can sense the non-verbal behaviours. They can't understand the words because they're just a dog. But they can understand the non-verbal communication. The way that person has their shoulders relaxed, their facial muscles relaxed, the way their eyes are smiling, the way they're breathing calmly, the way their arms are rested and their hands are rested. And they can read this non-verbal behaviour, and they know this person's safe, calm, friendly. And the person reaches out towards the dog with his palm upwards. And then as he moves his hand past the dog's head, he turns his hand round and he starts to stroke the dog firmly and gently on the head. And the dog allows this to happen, feels a sense of connection, of calmness. And while the man's stroking the dog's head, the dog begins to get this idea that something's being communicated somehow, almost non-verbally, almost like thought to thought, that something is being communicated about a lost land, about somewhere he needs to go. And so the dog begins to internalize this message, this thought-to-thought message about a lost land, about having to alter time and help the people of that land. And that somehow it has something to do with his past, but the dog doesn't know what. And the person removes their hand, sits back on the wall, and gestures for the dog to cross the bridge. And so the dog crosses the bridge. and starts running along the path the other side of the bridge, and then runs off into a meadow and carries on running through undulating hills, up and down through that meadow. Unsure exactly where they're going, what they'll find, and how they'll know when they've got there. And so, as that dog runs, they approach some woodland, and they walk into the woodland and notice that it's darker in the woods, that the sounds have changed. They can hear the rustling leaves. They can feel the subtle breeze. And they wonder how they're going to find a lost land when they don't even know where this lost land is. They just know it's somehow in this direction. So they carry on through the woods. And they get to the other side of the woods, and they come out of the woods. And so far everything seems normal. They don't see how they can find a lost land when a land is unlikely to be lost if it's in walking distance of where they were. And as they continue walking, they see a lake in the distance. And they walk towards that lake, noticing how calm and smooth the lake is, the way it reflects the colours of the sky. And as they arrive at the lake, so they decide to jump into the lake and go for a swim. And so they run towards the lake. They launch themselves off the bank into the water. And as they splash down into the water, the strangest thing happens. They pass underwater, but they don't resurface. They find that they land on the shore of a different land. A land that looks familiar in some way, but they've never seen it before, never experienced it before. And they wonder whether this is the lost land, this land that can only be found through the lake. They don't know why them jumping into the water meant they arrived here, whether that would always happen or it was just a one-off. But they assume here is where they're meant to be right now. So they continue to explore, and they start exploring this land. They see a path and they start following that path. They don't know quite where it's going to take them, what they're going to discover, or what it is they have to do. And so they follow the path into some woodland. Only this woodland has a different sound to the previous woodland. There's something about its silence, that there is still some sound there, but they have this feeling of it being silent. And they walk through the woods, and they find themselves feeling so calm and relaxed, feeling this is such a peaceful place with this silence, feeling that the silence is helping them to drift deeper and more relaxed inside. And they don't know where they've got to go. But they start to pick up a scent. And it's a curious scent. So they decide to explore it, to follow that scent and see where it leads them. And as they follow that scent, they eventually start to hear sounds, hearing sounds of people milling around, sounds of metal clinking on metal, all different sounds of hustle and bustle. And after a while, they find themselves approaching what looks like an ancient village. And there's some kind of building in the centre of this village, almost like everything is built around that central building. So they walk down towards that village. They don't know whether this is the lost land, and whether this is a lost village that they need to find, or what it is they need to do. And they enter the village, and they see people working, selling on stools, cleaning clothes, getting some food. They see different animals, like chickens and other animals running around. And they walk through towards that central building. And eventually, after a little while, they arrive at the central building. They find that the entrance to it are locked. They walk around the outside and they can't find any way in. So they decide they have to think about how they get in. They walk around the outside. They look up at all the different buildings. And they decide they can climb up onto the roofs of some of these buildings if they just back away from the centre a little. So the dog backs away, climbs up onto the buildings, and then sprints across the buildings, jumping from building to building, and eventually jumping over the wall into that central building. And once inside the central building, the dog notices how quiet it is in here. And the dog carefully walks around, exploring, following its nose. And there's very few people in this area. And the dog notices that the way this building is laid out is a wall around the outside with gates. And then the building is in like a U shape around a central courtyard. And right in the very centre, exactly in the centre of the bit of land, is a clock. And the dog remembers something about time and walks up to the clock and sits down in front of the clock, watching those hands and the tall stone clock. appears to be just ticking smoothly through time. And the dog watches those hands as they tick through time. And while watching those hands tick through time, the dog's attention begins to become more focused, narrower and narrower, until eventually everything around the peripheral vision begins to fade away. The only thing left is those hands ticking. And so the dog watches those hands ticking away, becoming more absorbed, deeper and deeper in the experience. And then as everything around the clock face begins to fade away, so the clock face begins to warp and alter as well. Almost like a wormhole forming. Almost like all of reality is twisting and bending around that center point. And the dog keeps its gaze on the clock face as everything warps and twists, until eventually everything starts folding back the other way. And the dog shakes its head as it comes out of a reverie and looks around and is surprised to see how everything has changed, how the house is no longer there, the village is no longer there. There's just this clock stood in the middle of nowhere. All around, in all directions, is just countryside and some woodland, meadows, undulating hills, and right in the centre, that stone clock ticking away. And the dog is curious about this, curious about what's happening, where it is, where the village has gone. And the dog starts walking around the clock, looking around left, right, up, down, behind itself, in front. And then off in the distance, the dog hears a weird kind of growling sound. They're not scared by this growling sound, just intrigued at what it might be. And so they decide to go in search of it, still trying to solve this mystery. So they go in search of that growling. And there's no paths to follow. They just have to follow their nose and follow the meadows, walking up and over hills, walking through woodland, going on a search for that growling. And after some time of searching through the meadows and walking through the woods, eventually the dog notices that the hills climb higher into mountains. So the dog starts to climb those mountains, follow those mountains up higher and higher. noticing how that occasional growling is closer now than it was before. And they notice the way the temperature changes as they get higher into the mountains. And they're really happy that they've got the fur they've got to keep them at a comfortable temperature. And they climb higher and higher into the mountains. And they start to hear this flapping sound. Almost like the sound that big birds make as they take off. And then high up in the mountains, the dog sees these dragons flying around over the countryside below. Some flying around and landing in the mountains. And the dog doesn't feel threatened at all by these dragons. Just feels that this is a land of dragons. Perhaps this is a time of dragons. And so the dog goes in search of the nearest dragon, wanting to communicate with that dragon, perhaps finding some answers for the quest that they're on. And after a while of walking through snow, climbing mountains, feeling that cold wind on the face and the fresh air in the nostrils, the dog sees a dragon stood just in front of him. And the dog walks over towards that dragon. And the dragon notices the dog, lets out a powerful breath of warm air, like a burst of warm air from the nostrils. And the snow between the dog and the dragon melts in that powerful warm blast, and the dog walks closer and closer. And the dragon and the dog just look at each other. And then somehow they can understand each other, almost like they communicate telepathically. And the dragon communicates about how this is a land dominated by dragons, way before man appeared on the land, after dinosaurs but before man. And these dragons know what was, know what is, and know what will be. And the dragons talk about how man needs dogs. But man isn't clever enough to realize this. Man is too self-centered, too self-absorbed, believing they're able to do everything themselves. And the dragons communicate that this will be man's downfall. And that what's needed is a connection to be formed. And that connection doesn't happen. So the job the dog needs to do is to facilitate that connection happening. To connect a man with a wolf, and to realise that the wolf isn't a dangerous beast, isn't a competitor for food, but can be a companion. And that if that connection can be formed, then the ancestors of that wolf will become companions of humans, and will help them in many ways. But the path that things are currently taking, that meeting doesn't happen. So the dog realizes what it is they need to do. They need to connect man and wolf. But given they're in the age of dragons, they don't know how that'll be possible. And the dragon looks over at a cave at the back of the mountain behind him. And the dog walks to that cave, walks through the cave, and finds themselves walking out of a cave in another time, in another place. And they know they need to somehow connect man and wolf. And given their experience that they have had, they're aware that somehow they must have just travelled through time again. So the dog roams around, listening out and smelling out for other dogs or wolves, and listening out and smelling out for humans. And after quite a while of roaming around, of walking through forests, walking through dense woodland, walking over tall hills and into valleys, the dog finds a pack of wolves. And goes over and talks with those wolves, talks with them about how they can create a relationship with man. And they're skeptical because they see man as something that attacks them anytime they go near. And the dog explains that they're destined to be together. They're destined to be companions of each other. And so the leader of the pack goes with the dog to seek out a human, to form that first relationship. And they explore around the area. And the dog explains that humans will follow the water, so they find their way down to a river. And they start walking along the edge of the river until eventually they see a young human. And the human is trying to catch some fish. And the dog tells the wolf to cut the fish off, to help catch the fish for the human. And the wolf thinks, but they need to eat as well. They should catch the fish for themselves. And the dog explains that if you can create a relationship you'll have more food for each other. You can work together. And the wolf had never tried this before with a human. And so cut off the fish, stopping them being able to escape, allowing the human to catch that fish. And the human saw what had happened and didn't know how to react, didn't know whether to be scared of the wolf or grateful to the wolf, whether it was intentional, or maybe the wolf was trying to get that fish for themselves. And then the wolf helped again and again. And the human began to realize that the wolf is helping. The wolf isn't just badly attempting to catch these fish for themselves. And the human throws down a fish towards the wolf, and the wolf picks it up and has that fish. And then a bear comes out of the woodland and starts charging towards that human. And the wolf runs and jumps in front of the bear and growls. And the human jumps back and starts running out into the water and across that river. And then the wolf makes chase after the human. And the human realizes the wolf put themselves on the line to help. And that they managed to stall the bear long enough for the two of them to get safe. And the dog watches from a distance as this wolf and this young human begin to interact in a friendly way. And they know that other humans won't at first realize that this connection is valuable. But the dog watches for a little while as that wolf at first helps that one human, and then the wolf and their pack start helping the humans in this little settlement. They help to alert the humans to potential threats approaching the settlement, alerting the humans faster than the human senses can pick up, being able to recognize predators from sense of smell before they've come into sight of the humans. They're able to control the few livestock that the little settlement has with them. They're able to help carry things. They're able to help with hunting. And what this little settlement of humans realizes is they also make great companions. That it's like you have company when you're out on a hunt. It's like you have company when you're at home alone. And the dog watches and realizes that this looks like it'll be the start of a wonderful relationship. that these wolves will become calmer, be less aggressive so quickly, become more trusting of humans. And over the many, many years, the relationship will improve and get built upon. And so the dog begins to find its way back towards that cave, hoping that its work here is done. And it finds its way back towards the cave, walks through the cave, finding itself up high in that snowy mountain, seeing the dragon just chilling there. And the dragon and the dog communicate with each other, and the dragon lets the dog know that they've changed the course of history, that in the future when humans arise, that event will happen. Humans will talk about it, will share the knowledge, will share the strengths of having a companion. And that'll continue through history. And the dog's curious about what happened to the dragons, because the dog knows in the future there isn't any dragons. But the dragon doesn't answer. And the dog doesn't know whether that means the dragons are still around in the future or not. And the dragon eventually just lets the dog know that everything turns out as it should. And the dog starts finding its way down that mountain and finding its way back through the countryside and forests, through dense woodland. And then back through all the meadows, finding its way to that clock. And the dog sits down in front of the clock, watches as those hands turn, keeps the eyes on those hands as they turn, notices how the peripheral vision begins to disappear. Tunnel vision sets in, and then everything begins to swirl and turn around that clock face, and then unswirl and turn the other way. And as reality comes back, they find themselves sat in that old location with that U-shaped building. And they start to find their way out of that building, jumping up and over the wall, finding their way back to that bridge, where that wise person tells them that they've done a great job. And they don't understand the words, but they understand the non-verbal communication that lets them know they're being told they did a great job, that they've changed the course of history. And then the dog started heading back, and at some seemingly random point they leapt into the air and found themselves exiting the water and landing on the shore as if they've just leapt out from under the water, landing on the shore of that lake. They started walking back along. And they realised that time was still a bit jumbled, as the past, the present and the future were all merging, as they saw that wise one again and realised they'd already spoken to him. And he just smiled. And the dog realised that there's a ripple through time and space. And that dog is walking back to the present at about the speed of that ripple in time, keeping aware of the changes they've made, because they're just ahead of that reality. So some bits get jumbled and scrambled, and yet the whole experience is comfortable. And then after a while, they wake up, feeling the warmth of the morning sun, hearing the sounds of morning birds, the lapping of the lake, and their companion preparing some food in a metal container. And they start thinking to themselves about this experience. As their companion comes out of the tent, they start thinking to themselves, while he's heading over with a little bit of food and he puts it down in front of the dog, how its only experience has been that dogs have existed and been companions of humans. And it tries to work out whether this was all a dream, or whether something really did just happen. And the dog starts thinking it's most likely just a dream. But it felt incredibly real. And the dog thought about the fact that if it was real, it means that it was inevitable, that they were going to be successful. Because the future is what it is, the present is what it is. Memories of the past are what they are. It doesn't change from moment to moment. So for the dog to have grown up as a dog, for dogs to be companions of humans, the only option is that whatever happened in the past happened successfully. Because if it had failed, then that would be the future. And the only memory the dog has is of one line of reality. And the dog thinks to themselves that it was obviously just a dream. But as they think that, they see a dragon land on the other side of the lake and look over at them. And they pick up almost this telepathic communication of the dragon letting them know it was all real. The whole experience did happen. That this future they've grown up knowing is because of this one moment in time where they went back and created this course of reality. And then the dragon launches itself back up into the air swoops left over the trees and vanishes. And the dog turns to the food placed in front of it, eats that food, while its companion pats it on the head, gives it a stroke. And they spend the day down by the lake as they had done many times before, catching some fish, going for walks, enjoying their time together. And then at the end of the day, the companion goes into their tent again, settles down for the night. The dog goes to the tent, pokes its head in the tent as if to ask if it can come in as well. And the companion moves aside slightly, pats the ground, and the dog walks in and snuggles down. And the companion starts stroking their back gently, and the dog feels that gentle stroke on the back and feels the way it makes them comfortably drift off asleep.